You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Fiduciary duty, a concept rooted in trust-based relationships such as those between trustees and beneficiaries, has gained increasing relevance in privacy and data governance. When organizations collect and manage personal information, they are effectively stewards of that data, entrusted to act responsibly on behalf of individuals whose lives may be impacted by how the data is used. Applying fiduciary duty concepts to privacy frames data handling not just as a matter of compliance, but as an ethical obligation grounded in care, loyalty, and good faith. For exam candidates, this means recognizing that fiduciary duty transforms privacy programs into more than legal checklists. They become systems of trust, requiring organizations to demonstrate that their actions align with individuals' expectations, rights, and reliance on promised safeguards. This framing emphasizes both accountability and trustworthiness in modern data practices. The duty of care sets a standard of reasonableness in privacy and security decisions. Organizations are expected to implement safeguards that reflect the risks posed by the data they collect and process. This includes conducting risk assessments, deploying security controls, and preparing incident response strategies. For example, a healthcare provider handling sensitive medical information is expected to adopt encryption, access controls, and regular vulnerability testing. On the exam, the key concept is reasonableness. Did the organization act as a prudent steward of personal data under the circumstances? The duty of care anchors the operational side of fiduciary responsibility, requiring diligence in designing, implementing, and maintaining privacy programs to prevent foreseeable harms. The duty of loyalty requires organizations to avoid conflicted uses of personal data that benefit themselves at the expense of individuals. Self-dealing might occur if a company collects data under the guise of service delivery, but then monetizes it through undisclosed third-party sales. For learners, loyalty is about alignment. The organization's use of data must align with the purposes communicated to individuals and with their expectations. On the exam, scenarios may test whether a practice represents a conflict of interest, such as secretly profiting from secondary uses of sensitive information. Loyalty ensures that organizations place the interests of data subjects ahead of their own financial or operational incentives when those interests conflict. The duty of good faith and fair dealing emphasizes honesty and integrity in privacy commitments. Organizations must honor the promises made in privacy notices, contracts, and consent agreements. This includes avoiding manipulative practices such as burying critical disclosures in unreadable terms or designing interfaces that trick individuals into giving consent. For exam candidates, the key concept is fairness. Are privacy promises honored transparently, and are individuals treated with respect in how choices are offered? Good faith obligations connect closely to trust, reminding organizations that compliance is not only about technical adequacy, but also about maintaining ethical credibility in their relationships with consumers, employees, and partners. Board oversight and tone at the top form critical components of fiduciary responsibility in privacy governance. Boards are expected to monitor data risks alongside other enterprise risks, ensuring privacy receives attention at the highest level. Tone at the top refers to leadership's commitment to embedding privacy values into culture, policies, and operations. On the exam, candidates should recognize that fiduciary duties extend beyond operational staff to directors and officers. Failures at the governance level, such as ignoring known privacy risks or underfunding compliance, can undermine organizational accountability. Strong board oversight demonstrates alignment with fiduciary principles by ensuring data protection is prioritized strategically, not treated as an afterthought. Officer and director responsibilities in privacy programs extend beyond high-level oversight to ensuring that controls are effective in practice. Executives may be accountable for allocating resources, appointing competent privacy leaders, and setting measurable goals. Directors may be expected to question whether risk assessments, audits, and compliance reports adequately address data handling. For exam purposes, this reflects fiduciary duties application to organizational leadership. Candidates should recognize that fiduciary duties require leaders to act with diligence, ask probing questions, and support accountability structures that embed privacy into day-to-day operations. These responsibilities ensure fiduciary principles are not symbolic, but operationalized across the organization. Fiduciary duty triggers apply across multiple data contexts, including customer data, employee records, and partner information. Each context carries unique risks, but shares a common expectation of stewardship. Customer data misuse may harm consumer trust, employee data mishandling may undermine workplace rights, and partner data failures may jeopardize contractual relationships. For learners, fiduciary duty applies broadly, regardless of data source. On the exam, candidates should recognize that fiduciary obligations are not limited to consumer-facing activities, but extend to all personal data under organizational control. This universality reinforces the idea that fiduciary duties are about the relationship of trust wherever it arises. Reasonableness benchmarks guide organizations in fulfilling their duty of care. These benchmarks may include industry standards, regulatory frameworks, or voluntary codes, such as the NIST privacy framework. For exam candidates, benchmarks provide reference points. Did the organization's safeguards align with widely accepted practices? Reliance on benchmarks demonstrates diligence, reducing exposure to claims of negligence. On the exam, scenarios may test whether practices meet reasonable standards or fall below expectations. Recognizing benchmarks underscores that fiduciary duties require organizations to measure themselves against external norms, not just internal judgments of adequacy. Reliance on experts and documented decision-making strengthens fiduciary accountability. Boards and executives often rely on privacy officers, consultants, or auditors to provide specialized knowledge. Documenting decisions, such as why certain safeguards were chosen, creates evidence of diligence. For learners, documentation is essential for proving fiduciary compliance. Exam questions may test whether reliance on experts shields leaders from liability if decisions were made in good faith and supported by records. This reflects how fiduciary duties are operationalized, through reasoned judgment, backed by expertise and transparency in governance processes. Vendor selection and supervision represent another area where fiduciary accountability is critical. Organizations are responsible not only for their own practices, but also for ensuring that vendors handling personal data meet required standards. This includes conducting due diligence, negotiating data processing agreements, and monitoring performance. For exam candidates, the key concept is accountability. Fiduciary duty does not end when data is transferred to third parties. Scenarios may test whether organizations exercise proper oversight of vendors, particularly after a vendor-related breach. Fiduciary responsibility ensures that organizations extend their duty of care beyond internal boundaries into their external data ecosystem. Transparency and reliance interests created by privacy notices highlight fiduciary obligations of good faith. When individuals rely on an organization's statements about how data will be handled, the organization assumes a fiduciary-like duty to honor those commitments. Misrepresentations or omissions violate both trust and fairness principles. For exam candidates, the key terms are reliance and transparency. Scenarios may test whether individuals could reasonably rely on a notice when making decisions about sharing data. Recognizing this dynamic underscores that fiduciary duty is grounded not only in legal obligation, but also in the trust individuals place in organizational assurances. Consent management, purpose limitation, and trust expectations connect loyalty and good faith to operational practices. Organizations must collect data for specific purposes, obtain valid consent, and avoid secondary uses without disclosure. For learners, these practices illustrate how fiduciary duties translate into concrete compliance measures. Exam scenarios may test whether consent was meaningful or whether data uses aligned with stated purposes. Recognizing this alignment reinforces the idea that fiduciary duties require respect for individual autonomy and reliance interests, not just technical compliance with statutes. Data minimization and retention controls demonstrate the duty of care in action. Organizations must avoid collecting more data than necessary and must securely dispose of data once its purpose is fulfilled. For exam candidates, minimization and retention are operational safeguards reflecting prudent stewardship. Scenarios may test whether an organization's retention policies align with fiduciary duties, emphasizing that keeping unnecessary data increases risk and undermines trust. These principles highlight the balance fiduciary duty requires, maintaining necessary information while reducing exposure by avoiding excess. Incident preparedness, including tabletop exercises and testing, illustrates fiduciary duties of care and diligence. Organizations must anticipate breaches, plan response strategies, and practice execution. For exam purposes, preparedness is a hallmark of reasonable care. It shows that leaders did not ignore foreseeable risks. Scenarios may test whether organizations conducted drills or documented incident response planning. This reinforces the idea that fiduciary duty extends beyond prevention to include readiness, ensuring that harms are mitigated swiftly and transparently when incidents occur. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Conflicts of interest arise when organizations use personal data for monetization or secondary purposes that benefit themselves more than the individuals who entrusted the information. For example, if a company collects data to provide a service but then sells it to advertisers without clear disclosure, it risks breaching its duty of loyalty. Such actions undermine trust and highlight why fiduciary frameworks emphasize transparency and alignment with user expectations. For exam candidates, recognizing conflicts of interest is key. They are red flags that signal when organizational incentives may diverge from individual rights. A fiduciary approach requires disclosing secondary uses, seeking explicit consent, and ensuring that individuals' interests are not compromised for short-term gain. Dark patterns and manipulative design raise similar concerns under duties of loyalty and good faith. These are interface tactics that nudge individuals into sharing more data or accepting less privacy than they would have chosen under neutral conditions. Examples include pre-checked consent boxes, misleading button labels, or confusing opt-out flows. While not always illegal, these practices can violate good faith by frustrating reliance on fair notice and informed choice. For exam purposes, the key terms are manipulation and fairness. Scenarios may test whether consent was obtained through deceptive design. A fiduciary model demands that organizations design with honesty, ensuring that choices are presented clearly and fairly, without exploiting cognitive biases for data advantage. Algorithmic bias and fairness risks extend fiduciary duties into automated decision-making. When organizations deploy algorithms for hiring, lending, or insurance, biased outcomes can harm individuals disproportionately, often without their awareness. Fiduciary duty requires organizations to test for bias, document safeguards, and ensure that automated decisions align with fairness expectations. For learners, the key terms are bias and accountability. Exam scenarios may test whether an organization has taken reasonable steps to mitigate discriminatory impacts of algorithms. Fiduciary principles demand that technology-driven decisions honor the same duties of care and loyalty as human-driven processes, reinforcing accountability in an era of automation. Cross-border transfers introduce fiduciary obligations to oversee safeguards and contractual controls. When personal data moves internationally, organizations must ensure that protections remain intact despite differing legal regimes. This involves assessing risks, incorporating contractual safeguards such as standard contractual clauses, and monitoring vendor compliance abroad. For exam candidates, the key idea is oversight. Fiduciary duty requires ongoing vigilance, not one-time contractual commitments. Scenarios may test whether cross-border transfers included adequate diligence and monitoring. Recognizing these responsibilities highlights how fiduciary principles extend across borders, ensuring that stewardship obligations are not abandoned once data leaves domestic jurisdiction. Children and teens represent heightened duty populations because of their vulnerability and limited ability to provide informed consent. Fiduciary duty requires additional protections, such as stricter consent standards, default privacy by design measures, and avoidance of exploitative monetization. For learners, the key concepts are heightened protection and vulnerability. Exam scenarios may test whether organizations provided adequate safeguards for minors, reinforcing that fiduciary duties scale with the sensitivity of the population served. This principle ensures that trust obligations adapt to the capacities and risks of those whose data is handled. Health, financial, and biometric data also trigger elevated fiduciary duties due to their sensitivity. Misuse of this data can lead to severe consequences, including identity theft, discrimination, or stigma. Fiduciary duty requires heightened safeguards, minimization, and strict purpose limitation for these categories. For exam candidates, the key terms are sensitivity and proportionality. Scenarios may test whether organizations applied sufficient controls for high-risk data. Recognizing these elevated duties underscores how fiduciary obligations adapt to the potential impact of misuse, demanding higher diligence where stakes are greatest. Authentication, access control, and least privilege embody the duty of care in technical safeguards. Organizations must ensure that only authorized personnel can access personal data and only to the extent necessary for their role. This reduces risk by limiting exposure and preventing unauthorized use. For exam purposes, the key concept is least privilege. Scenarios may test whether an organization implemented appropriate access controls. Recognizing these technical measures illustrates how fiduciary duty translates into everyday operational practices, embedding care into system design and user management. Auditability, logging, and traceability support good faith by providing evidence that systems operate as promised. Logs create accountability, showing who accessed data, when, and why. Without auditability, organizations cannot prove compliance or investigate potential breaches effectively. For exam candidates, the key terms are logging and evidence. Scenarios may test whether an organization maintains sufficient records to demonstrate fiduciary compliance. These practices reinforce the principle that good faith is not only about intent, but also about creating verifiable records of action. Breach response, notification, and remediation illustrate fiduciary duties in action during crises. Organizations must respond swiftly to contain incidents, notify regulators and affected individuals, and provide remediation such as credit monitoring. Fiduciary duty demands transparency and diligence, ensuring individuals are informed and supported in managing potential harms. For exam purposes, the key terms are notification and remediation. Scenarios may test whether breach response was timely and adequate. Recognizing these duties underscores that fiduciary responsibility persists even after failures, requiring organizations to act with integrity in addressing harm. Independent assessments and third-party assurance demonstrate diligence and care. By subjecting privacy programs to external audits or certifications, organizations provide evidence that controls meet fiduciary standards. These assessments serve as safeguards against complacency and create confidence for regulators and consumers alike. For exam candidates, the key idea is demonstrable diligence. Scenarios may test whether organizations engaged independent assessors as part of fiduciary obligations. Recognizing this principle reinforces the expectation that stewardship includes validation, not just internal assertions of compliance. Metrics and key risk indicators provide boards and executives with insight into privacy risks, supporting their fiduciary oversight role. Common metrics include the number of incidents, consumer complaints, or completion rates for employee training. Reporting these indicators ensures that privacy risk is visible at governance levels, enabling informed decision-making. For learners, the key terms are metrics and reporting. Exam scenarios may test whether boards received adequate risk information. Recognizing these practices illustrates how fiduciary duty integrates into organizational governance structures, reinforcing accountability from the top down. Documentation, meeting minutes, and rationale for decisions substantiate good faith. Regulators and courts often look to whether organizations documented why certain privacy choices were made, particularly when alternatives were available. For exam candidates, the key concept is substantiation. Fiduciary duty requires not only making decisions but also recording the reasoning behind them. Scenarios may test whether organizations maintained adequate documentation to prove diligence. This practice ensures that fiduciary obligations can be demonstrated long after decisions are made, reinforcing the culture of accountability. Whistleblower channels and ethics hotlines support fiduciary culture by providing safe avenues for employees to report concerns. Encouraging reporting demonstrates good faith and strengthens organizational accountability. For learners, the key terms are whistleblower and ethics. Exam scenarios may test whether organizations provided such channels as part of fiduciary compliance. Recognizing this principle emphasizes that fiduciary duty is not only structural but cultural, requiring systems that empower individuals to surface risks without fear of retaliation. Continuous improvement cycles sustain fiduciary obligations over time. Privacy risks evolve as technology and regulation change, meaning static programs quickly become outdated. Organizations must regularly review, update, and enhance controls to reflect emerging risks and best practices. For exam purposes, the key idea is iteration. Scenarios may test whether organizations adopted continuous improvement mechanisms. Recognizing this obligation reinforces that fiduciary duties are ongoing, requiring stewardship that evolves rather than remaining fixed. By synthesizing duties of care, loyalty, and good faith, candidates see how fiduciary concepts translate into operational privacy practices. These duties anchor privacy governance in trust, requiring reasonableness, fairness, transparency, and diligence across all data handling activities. For exam success and professional practice, fiduciary framing highlights that privacy compliance is not only legal but also ethical, demanding that organizations uphold the trust placed in them by individuals whose information they control. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.